June 22nd, 1990. To the amazement of most Canadian politicians, he said no. The summer of 1990 and the tragic conflict at Gunasadage and Gunawage, the emotional and psychological trauma suffered by all involved, and the unprecedented coverage by a white press of the election of the new chief of the Assembly of First Nations.
Sego, I'm Dale Montour. Welcome to Aboriginal Voices. This is a program about the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. Sparked by the events of the summer of 1990, there has been a resurgence amongst the Indigenous nations of this country. They are asking that their land be restored to them, that their culture be protected, and that their right to self-determination be recognized. In this series, we will be speaking to them about these issues and about themselves. We feel it's important that the rest of the Canadian public understand. On today's show, we're going to set the record straight. That in fact, our history did not begin in 1867, and in fact, we have been around for thousands of years and have had a profound impact on Canadian history. You'll find out just how paternalistic the Indian Act is, and we will speak with Arthur Solomon, author and elder, about what it's like to be an Aboriginal person in this country.
Dr. Bruce Trigger is a professor of anthropology at McGill University in Montreal. Naturally interested in anything that has been written about Native peoples, I came across his book, Natives and Newcomers, Canada's Heroic Age Reconsidered. Dr. Trigger's book, unlike so many other distortions, actually argues that Native people have played a significant role in shaping the development of Canada. It investigates the stereotypes about Native people that have long influenced the development of Canadian history and anthropology. Imagine reconsidering and revising history for a more accurate understanding of our past. It seemed natural that we should start with him. What do you hope to achieve by revising or rewriting history?
I think that the most important objective of white Canadians studying Native history at the present time should be to make clear the nature of Native policy, so that as that comes to the attention of all Canadians through popular publications, through magazine articles, television programs, and I think most importantly in terms of textbooks, you will have a public which is informed as to what the real situation has been in the past, and perhaps that will influence the way they regard Native people and what Native people can accomplish at the present time.
Why have the Native people been left out of Canadian history?
History has until very recently been a history of winners, which means that it's been a study of males rather than females. It's been a study of white people rather than non-white people. And in Canada, it was a study of Anglo-Saxons, and because there were too many French Canadians around to completely dismiss them, of French Canadians who were co-opted into the history books as well as into the governmental structure. So the real reason that Native people have been traditionally left out of Canadian history is that they've been left out of the power structure of Canadian society.
What was the nature of the relationship between the Indigenous peoples and Europeans at the time of contact?
Well, I think the record is pretty clear about that. The Native people welcomed the first Europeans who came. They welcomed them because they seemed quite open to all sorts of different people. And they soon recognized that Europeans had various things in the way of metal tools and varieties of ornaments and other things that they found interesting. So at the beginning, the relationship was a very welcoming one, and the first European settlers would almost certainly have died over the first winters if Indians hadn't looked after them. Cartier's people would have died of scurvy if the Indians hadn't taught them how to cure scurvy that first winter at Quebec City. The relationship was a very positive one, and so long as the fur trade lasted, the relationship remained a good one because Native people had something that Europeans wanted, that Europeans could make a profit from. The Europeans had things Native people wanted. For a long time, Native people were strong enough that they really set the terms of the relationship, and it was a good relationship.
Why did the relationship change?
Well, it basically changed because so many Europeans settled in North America, and so many Native people died of smallpox and other European diseases that were introduced, that eventually the Europeans achieved a numerical preponderance that simply meant that they no longer had to take the feelings of native people into consideration. And at that point, of course, when Europeans wanted land either for farming or for mineral exploitation and so on, then their attitude toward native people became more and more domineering, and less attention was paid to native feelings in terms of formulating policies. The main aim was really the hope was, I think, perhaps hope isn't quite the right word, but the belief was that native people were bound to die out. Of course, today native people are increasing faster than any other ethnic group in the country, so obviously that expectation was not something that happened. And by the 20s, there was a big turnaround in terms of native demography, and today it's quite clear that native people are here to stay. But it took a long time for Europeans to realize that that was the case, and in that period when they thought native people were going to disappear, they began to assume that they had a right to do whatever they wanted with the continent.
Do you think this has affected the present-day government policies on indigenous peoples?
The realization that native people were too few in number to physically resist European encroachment anymore meant that the government formulated policies which really took native people into account, not at all. But also, in order to justify those policies, the government found it necessary to constantly portray native people as basically incompetent, as not knowing how to look after their own interests, as not being able to learn how to look after their own interests. And that was seen as justifying a very paternalistic kind of regime, which has lasted down to the present day.
Do you think at some time we can live peacefully together in this country?
Well, I think it's very important that in the Oka crisis last summer, one had extremely inflammatory statements coming out of federal and provincial politicians, ones which echoed some of the most outrageous distortions of native people of earlier times. The notion of natives, and particularly the Mohawk, as being naturally violent and so on. And in spite of that, the public opinion has continued to back native people very, very strongly. There is enough of an understanding of the facts of the situation now that politicians are not able to manipulate public opinion the way they were able to do 10 or 20 or years ago or more. So I really feel something has been accomplished that maybe cannot in fact be turned around now.
Arthur Solomon has devoted 30 years of his life to the struggle of his people. Today, he sees hope around the corner.
We will reassert our sovereignty because we've never given that up.
Arthur Solomon has said that every human being is born into this life with a purpose. I guess he's known for a long time exactly what his purpose has been. For over 30 years, he has fought for and with North American Aboriginal peoples in their struggle for justice. He has helped his own people better understand themselves and find direction with their lives. He is what we call a respected elder. Recently, we visited Art and Eva at their farm in Hartley Bay, Ontario. For 78, Art Solomon is one of the most youthful and vigorous men I have ever met. His mannerisms are everything you'd expect from an elder, quiet and contemplative. I asked Art to talk about the past. What were we like before the white man? Why are we so different? I asked him to talk about today and about what he sees happening in the future.
Well, I say that we were less than perfect, as all human beings are. But we had our medicines complete. We had our spiritual ways complete. We had a philosophy based on the harmony, the power, and the beauty, and the sacredness of the creation. And we couldn't own the land. We couldn't own anything. We don't even own our own lives because there's not one of us who can say, I will be here tomorrow with absolute certainty. They came with the concept that you could own whatever you could get by any means whatsoever, by deceit or whatever. But they came with a philosophy based on a false concept. And that was the concept of materialism. We never had materialism. So that's what differentiates Native people in this sacred land from those who came, those strangers with their strange ways. And we were told already centuries before that there would be a strange people come. They would come with two faces. They would come with a face of brotherhood or the face of anger. Well, we know what face they came with. And they had devastated their own countries and then came over here and saw all these beautiful trees and these beautiful animals and everything. You could virtually walk up to a partridge and go pick it up. So there was food in plenty. And because that's the way the Creator made it. That's the way we intended to keep it. It would still be beautiful, everything beautiful. We didn't take more than what we needed, and we gave thanks for what we needed. Constantly gave thanks to the water and the air and to the fish. And whether we were traveling on water, if we traveled on water, we would make an offering to that water. So they thought, and they believed that we were worshiping false gods. It's not wrong to give thanks to the water. It's not wrong to give thanks to the air. It's not wrong to give thanks to our elder brother sun or grandmother moon. It was pagan to give thanks to a tree for asking for its medicine. It was pagan to give thanks for the berries and all the food that we ate. But we are giving thanks to the one who created and put it there, okay? That's the kind of pagans that we were. We had said to those people, those strangers who came, you're destroying the land and you know, you're doing all kinds of bad things, years and years ago. And they'd say, yes, we can see what you're saying, we can hear what you're saying. And, but one of the striking things about them was that they would come with no eyes and no ears. They wouldn't be able to see what we were trying to show them. They wouldn't be able to hear what we were trying to tell them. So that's been obvious to us for a long time. There's absolutely a renewal of our spiritual ways, which includes culture, because we had a total way of life. We didn't put things in compartments. So there's a renewal of spirituality, and it's happening because it has to happen. It's an imperative. We are sick people. We are devastated people, but we're coming out of it, very fast. And we don't have a lot of time. So it is an imperative for us to heal ourselves, to heal our communities, and heal our nations. And a very profound and very simple remedy is spelled L-O-V-E. It is that profoundly simple. And there's no other power on the earth or in the creation that is more powerful than that.
It is the written expression of colonial dominance over the First Peoples of Canada. Lawyer David Nabagawa will speak to us about the Indian Act, next on Aboriginal Voices. spoke other languages, we didn't exploit or own the land according to your standards, and we lived in harmony with nature. We definitely needed help. Paternalism, I think that's what they call it. And the ultimate expression of this paternalistic attitude was the creation of the Indian Act. David Nalugabo is a partner in a law firm in downtown Ottawa. They practice general law, but also specialize in Indian law. That means that this man knows the Indian Act intimately. Can you explain to us what the Indian Act is?
Basically, it's the act which governs on-reserve Indians in Canada. Governs virtually every aspect of their lives, from band governance to membership, categorization, and obtaining materials from on-reserve peoples, like crafts and that kind of thing. So it's fairly comprehensive legislation.
Why was it passed?
Well, it was, I guess there were a couple of purposes to its original enactment. Certainly one of them was to provide a mechanism for getting Indians out of the way of settlement. So in that respect, it had a kind of a segregationist policy. But it also, and this came to be the predominant purpose, and that was to assimilate Indians. So I guess a twofold purpose. One was to get Indians out of the way, and the second was to assimilate, civilize and assimilate Indians.
You tried to assimilate Indians by making it illegal for them to continue practicing their traditional forms of government. By making provisions in the Indian Act that said any Indian woman that marries a non-Indian man would lose her status, or by stating that in order to receive a university education, you would first have to give up your identity. These discriminatory clauses of the Indian Act were just recently removed in 1951 and 1985. The Act was passed in 1876. You mentioned settlement as a means of getting Indians out of the way. What did you mean by that?
Indian Act was a continuation of a policy of reserve systems. Reserve systems, in fact, reservations were around previous to the Indian Act, but the Indian Act was a continuation of the reserve systems. And reserves basically were allocations of pieces of land where Indians could be moved to conveniently to get them out of the way of the advancement of settlement by non-native settlers as the country was being opened up. It was a policy which was originally contained in the Royal Proclamation. There was a provision whereby Indians could surrender their Aboriginal title, and part of the surrender process throughout the country was that Indians would surrender their title to lands, and in return they would get a plot of a smaller piece of land, and they would usually get a continued rights to hunt and fish over a larger tract. And this was the formula which was, of course, placed into most of the treaties that were signed across the country.
Here's a few examples of just how much control it has over our lives. It has control over our wills and estates. It has control over the surrender of reserve land and land tenure. It decides who will be members of the band. And even if a band council passes a bylaw, the Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs still has final say over everything.
Of course, the big discussion these days is on the authority of communities to govern themselves, so the right of self-government. And the Indian Act provided basically for some limited form of self-government, a delegated model of self-government. In other words, it didn't recognize that Indians had the right and had authority to govern themselves.
So traditional forms of government were viewed as being uncivilized?
The traditional forms of government had very much to do with the land and the way people used the land. So I think it's again consistent with the policy of the Indian Act to remove people from the land, to undermine that basic principle which was inherent in Indian government, and to undermine that form of government and impose a contradictory system of government which wasn't at all consistent with Indian values, land values especially.
Yes, the government is negotiating self-government agreements, but in the form of delegated authority. They are, however, missing the point. We want them to recognize our inherent right to self-determination. What impact has the Indian Act had on Native people in this country?
Well, it's been very, being a very suppressive document, it's taken its toll in a number of different ways in terms of communities governing themselves. It's taken away, suppressed the traditional forms of government. So it's really, at this point, I think, beyond dispute that Indians were self-governing totally when Europeans arrived. Basically with the enactment of the Indian Act, with a totally contradictory system of government being placed on Indians, I guess that was one of the major and most detrimental impacts. The Indian Act also provided for mandatory attendance at schools, and earlier on, of course, the minister delegated that responsibility to residential schools. So you have the whole impact of residential schools, which is a direct result of the Indian Act. So it's been a major, it's hard to imagine, and it would be hard to measure what the impact and how detrimental the impact of the Indian Act has been on Indian people throughout the years, but it's been major.
That's our program for this week, but before we go, let's preview what's coming up on the next Aboriginal Voices.
Max Yeldon, chairperson for the Canadian Human Rights Commission, will speak about his 1990 annual report. We'll talk to the current Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs, Tom Sidden, and we'll learn about human rights abuses committed against the Inuit of northern Quebec in the 1950s. That's on the next Aboriginal Voices.
Thanks for joining us. For Alan Deliri, I'm Dale Montour. Onagiwahi, Dego Dedese.